I go by the name of Hank. Please don't call me Henry. It just makes me angry when someone does. I was sweating as I faced the jury and began my opening argument. I couldn't afford an attorney, so I represented myself. Was I nervous? Hell no. I was scared to death. I was facing 5 years in prison for assault and battery if I messed up defending myself in my criminal trial. My wife, Zelda, sat with holding hands with her lover in the audience, glaring at me, hoping that her testimony would move me out of her life and move me into prison. It was a dark and stormy night, just like in that trite novel I'd once read, when I met my wife, Zelda, about 20 years ago. Perhaps that gothic novel's beginning should have warned me to stay away from her, but she was so gorgeous and I was so lonely that I couldn't resist. She had her Datsun Z towed to the garage where I worked as a novice mechanic. It was my first week on the job, and I was eager to impress my boss and coworkers. Her car was a gorgeous fire engine red, but I couldn't take my eyes from Zelda. Her jet black hair complemented the red Z. Of course, I tried to check out her as well, but I was thwarted by the large coat she wore because even in Los Angeles evenings can be cold. Her car kept stalling for reasons unknown and then stopped turning on completely. It was 5 o'clock on a Friday night, and I still couldn't figure out what was wrong with her car. Zelda, or Jaja, as she preferred to be called, was supposed to drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco that night to attend her father's funeral the next day. Then she had to race back to Los Angeles for a final exam in real estate finance at UCLA. Her luggage was packed in the hatchback. I promised her that I would fix her car if it took me all night. As you can imagine, Jaja was not in a mood to kibitz with me, and I respected that. All the other mechanics had left, and I needed Jaja to hold a flashlight on the fuse box while I shimmied under the car. I went back and forth checking out the electric schematics and the fuse box. I removed, cleaned, and replaced each fuse, while Jaja now sat behind the wheel trying to start the car after I replaced each fuse. By 8 o'clock, I found that the one cracked clip that held one fuse wasn't making contact because of an almost invisible loose wire. I found and fixed the sucker. Electricity now flowed through the car, and as I looked at this young girl, electricity also flowed through me. Jaja cried because she needed to get on the road at once, but hated driving at night, especially in the rain. It rarely rains in Los Angeles, but when it does, your thoughts turn to Noah and his ark. She also had some night vision problems. She began sobbing uncontrollably about missing her father's funeral. I hugged her and told her to let it all out. She sank deeply into my arms. I was shocked by how attracted I was towards her and how comfortable she was with me. 2 days earlier, my live-in girlfriend of 6 months and I were seated at a dance club when a tall, muscular, expensively dressed man with a Rolex watch and a diamond pinky ring tried to pull her by the hand from our table to dance with her. He hadn't asked my permission. I ordered him to let go of her. I placed my hand on hers to prevent her from leaving. He forcefully removed my hand from her hand as he tightly squeezed it to the point of pain. When he laughed at me and asked what I was going to do about it, I kicked him in his shin really hard with my steel-toed work boot, then stomped on his toes. He hobbled away. My girlfriend followed him to apologize. She called me a grease monkey with no future and left with him. I won't tolerate being disrespected by anyone. I don't look forward to a fight, but I won't run away from one. I didn't want to return to my lonely apartment filled with old memories tonight. I had previously planned to go to a bar and get drunk, wake up vomiting and hungover, but I came up with a better plan for this weekend. I decided it was for the best that my girlfriend broke up with me. I would never have cheated on her, but now there was nothing stopping me from starting a relationship with Jaja. I stroked Jaja's hair and said that if she could arrange a place for me to stay in San Francisco, I would drive her up and back to LA after the funeral. I know it was impulsive, but that was the story of my life. I rarely looked before I leapt. I phoned my mother asking her to pack a bag for me with a suit and a thermos of coffee. Jaja phoned her mother and arranged for me to stay in their guest room. We left the garage, picked up my clothes, and took I-5 north. I guess my conversation wasn't that exciting because 10 minutes later, as we crested Sepulveda past, Jaja was sound asleep and leaning against me. Being this close to a beautiful woman helped me forget the bad breakup I had just endured. I kept my arm around her shoulders so she wouldn't fall over. About 6 hours later, as we crossed the Golden Gate Bridge to Marin, I had to wake up Jaja to get directions to her house. She opened her eyes and asked if it was her turn to drive. She looked around and saw that we had driven all night and directed me to her family's home. Zsa rang the doorbell. Her mother was wide awake, unable to sleep after her husband's death. Her mother and Zsa hugged. Then her mother hugged and thanked me for being the knight who rescued her daughter in her hour of need. Her mother had an open bottle of scotch on the table, and Zsa took out 2 more glasses from a pantry. I sat on a really comfortable couch. I'm not much of a drinker, and 1 drink after a full day of work and a 6-hour drive was enough to knock me out. A few hours later, as a hint of sunlight came streaming through the stained glass windows, through the rain clouds, I woke up on the couch, covered by several blankets. At the funeral, I held a large umbrella over the heads of Zsa and her mother. They both kept their arms around my waist to stay further under the umbrella. Taking care of these 2 grieving, sad women gave me a wonderful feeling of satisfaction. I admit it. I like taking care of people. I learned that from my father. He said you don't judge a man by his income or how tough he is. You judge a man by how he takes care of people who are important to him. After the funeral, I met her extended family, and most of them thought, by the way we interacted, that we'd been together for a while and said we made a lovely couple. Zsa took my arm as she explained that every girl dreams of finding her hero, and I was hers. The next semester, she moved out of the UCLA dorm and into my apartment. A year later, we married. My boss at the garage had been so impressed by the way I fixed Zsa's car and then drove her to San Francisco that he put the story in a newspaper ad to show what a caring garage he ran. I even got a raise out of it. Zsa got a job as a mortgage broker. She earned a lot of money but didn't enjoy the work. She confessed to me that despite her protests, her boss was flirting with her nonstop and that day had become handsy with her, trying to touch her inappropriately. This announcement further cemented my faith in my wife's fidelity. I suggested 2 solutions. She could quit, or I could go to her office and beat the crap out of her boss to teach him some manners. She quit the next day and became a real estate saleswoman. Her brains, looks, bubbly personality, and endless ambition made her a top saleswoman within 8 months. I moved from the Datsun shop to a Ferrari shop. Those cars were very temperamental, but I seemed to possess the magic to fix them. I was now making as much money as a car mechanic could possibly make. I earned more than most teachers and a lot of lawyers. We were careful with our money and saved as much as we could to buy a house. When my wife took time off from work to have babies, we could live quite comfortably on my income alone. I could have started my own shop and made even more money, but I didn't want the hours of administrative hassle that would keep me from my family. I just wanted to work on cars. I loved it so much that my wife claimed that I didn't have a job. I had a well-paying hobby. About once a month, my boss and I would buy an old Ferrari, restore it, sell it for a fortune, and split the money. All the money I earned from this side hustle went into a bank account to put my kids through college. As much as I loved my job, I loved my kids more. I limited my overtime so that I rarely missed dinner with my family. My major failure in life was trying to teach my daughters the rudiments of how a car ran and how to fix it. The thought of getting grease on their polished fingernails horrified them. I wasn't angry. They were, after all, just girly girls. In return, they failed to teach me how to match the color of my shirt to the color of my pants. We had a loving, symbiotic relationship. I fixed their cars, and they chose my clothing each day. My wife and I worked out at the gym we built in our garage, and we were both in really good shape for 2 old married people in their 40s, though in honesty I must admit that my hairline wasn't what it used to be. I did, however, refuse to use a comb-over to unsuccessfully hide that. I was content, but my wife said she was getting bored with our lives and wanted some excitement. So for our wedding anniversary, I took her for a second honeymoon to Hawaii. Actually, it was really our first honeymoon. When we married, all I could afford was a weekend up the road at a cheesy motel in Malibu. We stayed for several days, while all the other rooms changed occupants every 2 or 3 hours. It was more like a hotel love than a motel. The vacation package to Hawaii included a hula dancing lesson for Zsa. I had planned for the 2 of us to spend hours at the beach sipping margaritas, swimming and sunning, but things change. After her hula lesson, at the luau, every man in the group was drooling, and my wife enjoyed the effect she had on them. One man reached out to trying to touch her. I jumped up and took his hands before he could touch her. I bent back his fingers until he screamed. We went back to the room where we made love like teenagers for the rest of the trip. Though I didn't see much of Hawaii unless it was visible from our bed, I will always love the time we spent there. I thought we were both happy. My wife's ennui continued when we returned home. She insisted that she needed a lot of expensive cosmetic surgery to feel younger and better about herself. I thought she looked great the way she was, but her tears opened my wallet. I paid for all the cosmetic surgery. She threw herself into her work, producing twice the income, but at the cost of working twice the hours. She rarely joined her family for dinner more than once a week. I cooked. I drove our girls to school. I cheered them every weekend at their soccer or tennis games. My absentee wife had more important things to do, and our children often complained to her about it. She called them ungrateful and dismissed their feelings. They came crying to me, but I had no magic words to make them feel better. When my wife asked me to explain the importance of her work to our daughters, I told her that I agreed with our girls. My wife yelled that she shouldn't not have expected an uneducated car mechanic to understand. She stormed out of the house, only to return close to midnight, reeking of scotch. One evening, while my daughters and I watched our nightly fill of Law and Order reruns for the 10th time, my wife, with tears of pride and joy in her eyes, brought home a glass trophy announcing that she was the top agent of all 5 of her employer's offices. She put it on the place of honor above our fireplace, after removing a large photo of our family to make room for it. I couldn't help but think of all the family time she had given up for that worthless piece of glass. It was as if she traded the love of her family for that craven idol that she now stood before as if in prayerful worship. Our marriage went downhill from there. Each night as she returned home from cocktail hour with her coworkers, she ran into the shower without stopping to kiss me hello. She wasn't, however, fast enough for me not to smell a man's cologne on her. Her cell phone was of course blocked and guarded, so I wasn't able to find any clues there. It was clear to me and our daughters that my wife was having an affair. I warned my daughters that I was going to divorce their mother. I had an appointment with a divorce lawyer in 2 days. My girls begged me to wait until they graduated high school before I threw her out. One was a senior, the other a junior. They knew how badly their grades would suffer during a contentious divorce, and then they wouldn't get into a good college, despite all the money I'd saved for that over the years. They had enough friends who went through bad divorces to know what would happen. I promised that I would wait. I'd never denied my daughters anything, so I would put up with my wife's crap for their sake, even if it meant swallowing my pride for another year. I secretly still hoped we could mend this marriage, though I knew the odds were against it. The primary reason Jaja returned home at night was to get clean clothes my daughters and I washed. I didn't ask her if she was cheating. I just told her that if her current behavior continued, she would lose her husband and daughters. I was shocked that she didn't say a word or even care. I've read that this called the fog of an affair. One of my Ferrari customers was some sort of high-tech guy who sold his company for $1 gajillion and owned 5 Ferraris. I told him my problem. He laughed and offered his electronic expertise to help me spy on my wife. He told me to buy a GPS tracker for her car, place spyware on her cell phone and hidden recorders in our house, her handbag, and everywhere else I could hide. Then all I had to do was set up a Wi-Fi server in my home, connect them all through a Bluetooth protocol with redundant backup in the cloud. At that point, I stopped him. I didn't understand a word he was saying. I understand engines and transmissions, but GPS trackers and planting spyware on a smartphone on Cloud9 is just science fiction to me. I could more easily build a spaceship with warp drive if Scotty from Star Trek would lend me some dilithium crystals. I drove home past my wife's office and saw through the window that the staff was celebrating a Christmas party. I saw that most of the attendees were next to their spouses, but my wife hadn't invited me or even told me about the event. I parked next to a brand new Porsche 911 convertible and went inside. I sought out my wife and was devastated, though not shocked, to see some big, young, muscular guy arm in arm with her. And that's when it all hit the fan, and that's why I'm in court today in front of a jury facing felony charges for assault and battery. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm Hank Sintak. I'm a 45-year-old blue-collar car mechanic who is struggling to continue working because I have arthritis. I learned that my wife's company was having a Christmas party when I drove by, even though she had kept it a secret from me. My wife had said nothing about the party, so I thought I would just surprise her. Well, she wasn't the one in for a surprise. My wife is 40 years old and has a master's in psychology, which I might add, I paid for, and her boyfriend is 30. I'm not a lawyer. My only legal education has been watching the TV show Law and Order for 25 years. I'm representing myself because I can't afford a lawyer. In 20 years, I had saved $87,000 in a trust bank account for my daughters. That money was to send my 2 high school student daughters, Michelle and Stephanie, to college. I asked my daughters to stand up in the audience and blew them a kiss, which they returned. I noticed that most of the jurors smiled as I did that. When I walked into the party at my wife's office, and I pointed to Cody, he came up and ordered me to leave. He called me Little Henry and said he was now her man and I was just a useless old fool who had no place in her life, as he towered over me with large muscles built from hours lifting weights and taking steroids. Then he bragged that my girls weren't going to college. He crowed that at his insistence my wife took all of my money for my daughters that was in their trust bank account. He told me that my wife bought him a Porsche with it. That's when I allegedly beat the tar out of him. Cody claims I broke his nose and knocked out 4 of his teeth. Now, if that is true, it may be against the laws of man, but you have to ask yourselves if it's against the laws of nature. I mean, if a young handsome shit like that, I pointed to his face, well, I guess formerly handsome shit, can go around seducing the wives of older men and stealing the money their husbands spent 20 years working hard for, without fear of reprisal, then no one's marriage is safe. So, if these allegations are true, I not only defended my marriage, but I defended all marriages everywhere, including the marriage of each of you jurors seated before me. One of the jurors, a man in his 60s, pointed to the lack of a wedding ring on his ring finger and winked at me. If just one juror refuses to vote guilty, then there is a hung jury and a mistrial. I felt like I had just guaranteed myself a hung jury at the worst. The prosecutor had anticipated my plan of attack and explained that we can't condone vigilante justice in a civilized society. There is never an excuse for it. This situation would be best left to the divorce courts. I knew that's not a place where a husband who is the victim of infidelity can receive justice. My brother's wife cheated on him, and the court rewarded her and her boyfriend the family home and 10 years of alimony. Why do the courts basically encourage this despicable behavior? My first witness was my daughter Michelle. She testified that she was a senior in high school with a 3.9 average. She had received an early admission to Stanford University, but because her mother stole the money, I had saved over 20 years for her tuition, she could only afford a local 2-year community college. As she left the witness stand crying, she hugged me and loudly, for the sake of the jury, said I was the best father in the world and that she loved me. One woman juror cried. My second witness was my daughter Stephanie. She testified that her mother ignored the family and that, as the prosecutor suggested, I had planned to divorce my wife months ago, but didn't because she and her sister begged me to wait until after they graduated high school, no matter how badly my wife treated us all. That made a solid impression on the jury. She pointed to her mother and shouted to the jury that thieving 304 should be the one on trial for stealing our college money. The judge didn't even wait for the assistant DA to object before ordering the jury to disregard my daughter's outburst. The prosecution called his first witnesses. My wife testified that I beat the crap out of her boyfriend at the office Christmas party, but I never touched her. On cross-exam, I asked, "Who paid for your master's degree?" She admitted that I did. "Who paid for your cosmetic surgery last year when you insisted on them?" She admitted that I did and began cheating on me within days. "How long were you intimate with your 10-year younger boy toy?" The judge sustained the DA's objection. Then I asked if she withdrew all our money and mortgaged our house so I couldn't have funds to pay a divorce lawyer. The assistant DA objected, saying it was 2 questions. She admitted to both individually. When I asked who forged my name on the loan documents, she pleaded the 5th Amendment. Then she admitted that her boyfriend bragged about this to me and laughed in my face 1 second before I allegedly beat him up. I asked how she intended to pay for our children's college education. She didn't answer. I asked if her boyfriend's desire for a Porsche was more important to her than our children's future. Our daughters, who were in the audience, stood up and yelled that she was a 304 thief who stole their college money, and they never again wanted to see her. The judge had them removed from the courtroom, but the effect on my wife was devastating. The effect on the jury was obvious and crucial to my case. The assistant DA objected. It was sustained, but the jury saw what they saw and heard what they heard. My next witness was my wife's office manager. She was a bitter thrice divorced woman, though she was only about 30. Each of her divorces were based on her adultery. She testified that my wife bragged about her young lover for 6 months to everyone in the office, claiming I was just a grease monkey, too stupid to ever figure it out. She said my wife made no effort to keep the affair secret and reveled in treating me like a fool. The office manager readily admitted that she and others in management encouraged the affair because Cody was much more presentable to clients as her husband than a lowly car mechanic who always had grease under his fingernails. When her boy toy walked to the stand, I stood next to him. It was apparent that he towered above me. I was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and he was at least 6 feet 3 inches tall. I wanted the jury to see the height difference. I didn't pick a fight with someone half my size, but someone a lot bigger. He placed his left hand on the Bible. "Raise your left hand," I demanded. He struggled when he did. I removed the gold Rolex watch from his wrist. "I wish to enter this into evidence. Your Honor, would you read the inscription on the back?" The judge removed her glasses and read out loud. "To our grandson Hank Syntax. When did you steal my watch?" "I didn't steal it, little Henry," answered Cody. "Your wife gave it to me." He thought that belittling me in front of the jury was a good idea because he was an incredible shit. "So, you're saying that my wife stole it?" "Well, I didn't. So give it back to me, little Henry." The judge, a mature woman of 60 or so, handed it back to me and not Cody. "Your Honor, I believe the witness has just admitted to conspiracy to steal my $10,000 watch and receiving stolen goods. Can you instruct the Assistant District Attorney to file charges against Cody and my wife for this theft and the theft of my daughter's college funds?" Then I asked Cody how much money my wife gave him. He said he didn't know. I explained that I had the canceled checks. He admitted that she gave him over $125,000. "And what services did you provide to her to merit so much money?" He didn't answer, so I supplied an answer. "Are you that good a lover to deserve $125,000? The idiot smiled and answered, "Your wife thinks so. According to your wife, I'm a hell of a lot better in bed than you are, and also unlike you, and your little one, little Henry." He scowled at me. I was enjoying him destroying himself. Most husbands can't satisfy their wives. That's why these frustrated wives seek me out. He didn't realize that this won him no points with the jury. By the time he was done testifying, I think most of the men and half of the women on the jury also wanted to punch him in the face. I never showed any anger when he repeatedly called me little Henry. My father once taught me not to interrupt your opponent when he's intent on making a fool of himself. So, I was working overtime so my wife could pay you to be intimate with her. The assistant DA's objection was sustained. And finally, how many other married women have you slept with? None. He answered, before the assistant DA's objection was sustained. Your Honor, may I leave the courtroom for just a second to bring in some witnesses? The judge agreed. I walked back into the courtroom with 3 women and 4 children. I'm going to ask that question again. How many married women have you slept with? Asked and answered, shouted the assistant DA. Your Honor, I'm asking the question again to prove that the witness is a filthy liar who committed perjury. The judge turned to me and said, the correct legal term is that you wish to impeach the witness prior testimony. As she overruled the assistant DA's objection, the women and their children left the courtroom. 5, he answered. The families of how many children were destroyed because of you? He was silent. I know of at least 4 children who now live in broken homes because of you. Because of your repeated fun with married women, you lost 4 teeth and suffered 2 broken ribs. Do you think you'll try to seduce any more married women? Hell no, he quickly answered. So, all in all, this was a positive learning experience for you and prevented more broken homes and devastated children. I turned to the jury. I would call that a service to the community. Do you recognize the 4 men in the front row? No, Cody said emphatically. One of the men was hitting the palm of his left hand with his right fist, while another pretended to be cutting his own throat with his pointer finger. Well, they are the divorced husbands of some of the women that you seduced and had affairs with. Is there anything you'd like to say to them? Perhaps you'd like to apologize to them? At that point, the assistant DA objected, which was sustained. Remember their faces. You may see them again. Who knows, maybe even in a dark alley. The prosecutor called an emergency room doctor who testified to the damage I had inflicted on Boy Toy. On cross-examination, I asked if he was married. He was. I asked that now he knew all the facts, did he have any sympathy for the victim? None whatsoever, he replied. Next, the prosecutor called an occupational therapist who testified that Cody was so injured that he couldn't work and I was responsible for his lost income. On cross-examination, I asked the doctor what kind of work Cody did. He didn't know. So how? I asked, can you testify under oath that he can't perform his occupation if you don't know what it is? The doctor was silent. Can Cody maintain to be good in bed? I asked. The doctor said yes. I see. Well, since Cody made $125,000 as a male 304, in your medical opinion, can he continue to be intimate with married women who have children? Of course, the prosecutor objected, and it was sustained by not before the jury laughed. My theory, my strategy was if I could make jokes that caused the jury to laugh, they would be less likely to convict me. I wanted them to know that I wasn't a violent bully, just a wronged, mistreated husband seeking justice. Then I called my surprise witness. I have to tell you that I felt like Perry Mason, the title character in another of my favorite courtroom TV shows. His name was Eddie Cochran. He had contacted me after seeing my story on the evening news. The assistant DA spit out the water he was drinking at the prosecution table. He objected, saying that my witness testimony was irrelevant. I asked how he could know that before he testified. The judge temporarily dismissed the jury while he heard Cochran's testimony. Mr. Cochran, have you and the assistant DA ever met before today? Yes, he replied. 3 years ago, I was in an intimate relationship with his wife. He came to my house with 2 police officers, and they beat the hell out of me in front of him. Did he say anything to you while they beat you? Yeah, he said this is what wife-seducing a-holes deserve. Did you press charges? I asked. Hell no. They threatened that if I did, they'd throw me in jail for 10 years on some trumped-up charge after they planted drugs on me. The assistant DA again objected and claimed this testimony had no relevance to my trial. The judge nodded her head in agreement. Before the judge could sustain the objection, I said that the assistant DA has opened the door to this testimony when, in his opening argument, he claimed that vigilante justice had no place in our modern society and could never be condoned. That opened the door on this testimony, because now we learn that he personally employed it. The judge thought for a moment and then overruled the objection, recalled the jury, and allowed my examination of Mr. Cochran into evidence. Fortunately, I had recalled DA Sam Waterston employ this trick on a Law and Order episode show filmed 20 years earlier. Who needs law school if you have reruns on cable? Then what happened? I asked. That night his wife came to my apartment with a black eye and 2 broken ribs. She said he beat the shit out of her. Objection, hearsay, yelled the DA. Sustained, answered the judge. Now I was in the groove. Mr. Cochran, did you see a black eye on the assistant DA's wife when she came to your house? Yes, he answered. Did you take her to a hospital for her injuries? He nodded his head and said yes. Your witness, counselor, I said as I twirled a pencil between my fingers. No questions. The assistant DA replied. I tried to call my next witness, the DA's former wife, but the assistant DA asked if we could approach the bench. He didn't want her testimony on the record and agreed to drop all charges of assault and battery if I plead guilty to disturbing the peace and paid a $500 fine. I looked at the jury and refused his offer. No, I think the jury is on my side, and I want your record of domestic violence on the record. The judge left the bench for a few minutes and went into her chambers. She said we were taking a 30-minute recess. When court resumed, the judge had the biggest smile on earth. The assistant DA then told the judge that he would drop all charges against me. The judge refused. She wanted to hear the testimony from his ex-wife. An older silver-haired man entered the courtroom accompanied by a TV camera crew and 3 sheriffs. The judge smiled at him, and the assistant DA almost swallowed his tongue. His ex-wife testified how he beat her up that night, and not for the first time. She brought hospital records with her. The judge listened intently. After the assistant DA's ex-wife testified, the judge dropped all charges against me and asked the assistant DA's ex-wife if she would testify against her former husband. She declined because a man with his power would destroy her. The older man who had entered the court asked the judge for permission to speak. He introduced himself as the district attorney, which I already knew after watching his never-ending re-election commercials running on TV. I remembered the newscaster said he was behind 3% in the polls. The reporter on TV said he would need a miracle to win re-election. The DA informed the assistant DA's wife that her ex would no longer be an assistant DA after today, so she was safe to testify. He faced the TV camera and with the forced sincerity that all politicians are born with said, "I will never condone wife beating or allow an alleged wife beater to work in my office. Instead, I will personally prosecute him." One of the sheriffs handed the assistant DA some papers, handcuffed him, and led him away. Then the district attorney turned to my wife and her boyfriend. "You forged this man's name and took his home and the money this hardworking man earned for his daughter's college education and wasted it on an expensive sports car." He turned to the TV camera with his face etched in anger. One sheriff gave my wife papers and handcuffed her, while the third sheriff did the same for her boyfriend. "You two are under arrest for theft and conversion, forgery, bank fraud, and grand larceny." I realized that he was smart and used my criminal case to help him win his re-election. For once in my life, I had lucked out. I made a mental note to vote for him. Facing the TV camera, standing next to me, the district attorney said that his office was passionately interested in and only interested in justice. I knew I would see that statement and my face endlessly repeated in his TV ads, so I applauded him. The judge looked sternly at me. "Today you got a hall pass. The next time you won't be so lucky." "Your Honor, there will never be a next time," I said as I raised my right hand. That week my wife was fired from her job. The district attorney froze all of her bank accounts and assets. She tried to reconcile with me, but I laughed in her face. Our children refused to ever again speak with her. 2 weeks later, the DA won re-election, and a week after that I received an invitation to meet with him. He said I was the reason he was re-elected, and he was grateful. He said I was a better investigator than 90% of his staff. He offered me a job as an investigator in his office. I would first have to take and pass a 6-month course in criminal law and procedure at the local community college, but I would be working with an experienced investigator and on salary during that time. Since my arthritis was making my career as a mechanic almost impossible, I immediately said yes. He also insisted that I attend a 3-hour anger management seminar. "I wish I knew you when my wife divorced me," he said with a wicked smile. He was as good as his word and personally prosecuted the former assistant DA for spousal abuse. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison alongside of many convicts he had previously sent there. I heard that he won the Miss Congeniality Award from his fellow inmates. As a sort of signing bonus, the DA told me that he had indicted my former wife and her boyfriend for a variety of charges based on her stealing my watch, the bank account, the equity in our home, and forging my signature to do that. With all of her money either frozen or returned to me, she had no means to hire a good lawyer after she paid for her bail. She was represented by a brand new public defender who needed help finding her way to the courthouse. My ex and her lover each received 5-year prison terms. Our daughters and I never visited her despite her weekly entreaties and letters. I sued my former wife's former employer for intentional infliction of emotional distress because they knew of and condoned and encouraged my wife's affair. I used her boss testimony in my trial as evidence. I received $50,000 which I placed in my daughter's college fund because the cost of tuition is going up faster than I could save money for it. The next 2 years brought me enormous pride, joy, but also some sorrow and tears as I drove each of my daughters off to college, with 4 years of tuition for each safely in the bank secure from my wife's thieving hands. I had devoted my adult life to raising 2 competent, independent girls. I really missed them. Before they left, they made me a color chart so I could match the color of my pants with the color of my shirts. Even with their chart, my color matching ability was still hit or miss. My daughters warned me that my wife-choosing skills were also lacking, and they would pick out my next wife for me. I didn't click with any of the 3 women they introduced to me. I dutifully, as ordered, attended the anger management seminar, where I met and began dating Selma. A judge had ordered her attendance after she knocked out the teeth of her now ex-husband's girlfriend. This was a woman after my own heart. Now for the second story. My parents named me Emiliano Zapata, after my great-great-great-great-grandfather, the Mexican revolutionary who fought against corruption and injustice. I'm very proud of his legacy. You can call me an illegal alien or an undocumented worker. I don't care. I obey the laws of the Lord and the laws of the United States. I think I am a better member of the community than a lot of people fortunate enough to have been born in the United States. I was born in Tijuana, Mexico, and with my parents walked across the border to San Diego when I was 5, and then my uncle drove us to Los Angeles. My mother worked as a maid for the Davidsons, a wealthy family, and my dad started as a gardener working for someone else. He and my mother lived on rice and beans as they saved every dime they made until my dad could buy a truck, lawnmower, and other gardening tools to open up his own landscaping business. They both worked hard and each of them made a decent living, and we lived frugally. They taught me to forego instant gratification and plan for the long run. When I was 7, I attended an Easter egg hunt at the Davidsons' house with 20 blonde-haired, blue-eyed other children. My mother spent a week's salary buying me a new outfit and shoes to wear to the party, so I wouldn't look like a poor cholo. Then she scrubbed me almost raw. I was so clean that I glowed. I was so proud to have found 3 eggs. As I approached my parents to show them my treasure, Clark, the Davidsons' 12-year-old son, claimed that a stupid wetback wasn't allowed to have any of the eggs and took them away from me as he pushed me into the mud, ruining my new suit, while all the other children laughed at me. I didn't care how much bigger he was than I was. I was about to tackle him when my father grabbed me and tried to calm me down. Clark's parents didn't see what happened, and my mother never mentioned it to them. We quickly left. I never forgot the shame and humiliation that my family and I endured that day and vowed that someday I would have my revenge. I didn't know when that someday would happen, but I had learned patience from my parents. We never returned for future Easter egg hunts. I went to school and it became apparent that I was more than good with numbers. By the time I was 10, I did the bookkeeping for my illiterate father's landscaping business. When I was 13, I also worked as a bookkeeper for my uncle's bar. At 17, I was the captain of my high school's math team and competed in the citywide math Olympics. We won and I received a trophy which named me as a mathlete. My proud mother, my stoic father, and my aunts and uncles were so proud of me that at the ceremony they all cried as they hugged me and thanked the good Lord for everything that America had given us. Later, as we all ate dinner at my uncle's restaurant, a customer of his named Enrique, accompanied by 2 bodyguards, gave me a $100 bill. He said, "They call us ignorant wetbacks and worse, but with your brains you've brought pride and honor to our Mexican-American community." He also offered his help to me in the future, if I ever needed it. By 17, while a senior in high school, I was also a part-time bookkeeper for my mother's employers, the Davidsons, and their dress manufacturing business in LA's Garment District. They treated my mother and me decently, but their son Clark was still mean to us both. He called us wetbacks and laughed at us. He was an only child, a spoiled only child who was never disciplined by his doting parents. I graduated from high school with honors, but could only attend the local community college because I couldn't afford a full 4-year college. I won the math award from my junior college's math department. Clark dropped out of college after a few weeks, and 6 months later, when his father died and Clark took over the business. If you didn't know better, you might say that Clark was good at delegating responsibilities. If you did know the situation, you'd understand that Clark was a lazy bum who let others do all the work. I and the other employees had been expertly trained by Clark's late father and did our jobs without any supervision from Clark. From a community college course on business administration, I understood that good management wasn't complicated. 10% of the job of a manager was telling his subordinates what to do. The other 90% was making sure they did it and did it correctly. We'd all worked there for years. However, Clark was such a shit to everyone that one by one his father's old employees quit. I was one of the last to remain. The business started to trend downhill. It just needed a little push to go over the cliff. I'm not a CPA or even an accountant. I'm just a poor, dumb personal bookkeeper for a multimillionaire named Clark. I am 24. I don't make a fortune. Unfortunately, I learned that my gorgeous 23-year-old girlfriend now wants a man who does. I've been in love with her since I was a high school senior, and Maria was a sophomore who I tutored in math, while she taught me to dance. Dancing was important to her. At her 15th birthday party or quinceañera, I was her escort or chamberlains. I paid Linda, a sweet Mexican-American dress designer at the Davidsons Dress Factory, to design a dress especially for Maria's quinceañera. She looked gorgeous in that dress. All the other girls in attendance wanted dresses like that. I tried to convince my boss that this was a good untapped market to service, but he said the Mexican community couldn't afford expensive dresses, and that was the end of that idea. Maria and I danced a waltz together, and it was all over for me as I smelled her hair. Maria, several other boys, and I rehearsed the dance scene from the movie Dirty Dancing for over a week, and at the conclusion of our dance, Maria launched herself from the stage through the air and into my waiting arms. It brought down the house. Maria's great-grandfather called us the Latino Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I had no idea who they were or what that meant, but I thought it must be good. Maria was very clear that she chose me over her many other, better-looking admirers because she viewed me as her ticket out of the East LA Hispanic ghetto to the wealthy white suburbs near the ocean because I was smart, and we were both so light-skinned that we could pass. She looked like a younger Sofia Vergara, but without her sense of humor. With the help of my Aunt Rosario, who was a waitress at an expensive Beverly Hills restaurant, Maria landed a job and worked first washing hair, and then graduated to be a beautician at a very high-end hair salon in Beverly Hills. She was good at her job and had a lot of wealthy clients. Maria would often come home repeating the stories she heard from her clients about opulent vacations, expensive clothes, and luxurious cars. The common denominator these women shared was that they were pretty and had no talent other than marrying wealthy men because of their bedroom skills. Maria spent too much of our money copying the way these women dressed. This hampered my plan for us to save all our money for a house down payment. Maria was eating her insides up with jealousy and envy. I tried to warn her that she was violating the 10 Commandments with her covetousness and envy, but she didn't care. I knew that she wanted to emulate their lives, but I had no idea how far she would go to accomplish her aim or who she would trample over to get there. Maria was more than passionate in bed. She was a tigress. There were weekends when we left our bed only to eat or use the bathroom. We were so happy. Many times, I asked her to marry me, but she always said it was too soon, or we were too young, or some other excuse. Looking back, I now understand that she didn't want to be tied down to me. She was apparently looking to move up, and I was just the first step on her social climbing ladder. I hadn't had a clue. I am certainly not perfect. I don't attend church regularly, but ever since my parents drummed it into my head as a child, I tried to follow their example and obey the 10 Commandments. I didn't memorize all the words to all the prayers, but I figured that the commandments were the essential part of the Bible that had to be obeyed, and the rest wasn't as important, except the part of doing unto others. Maria, on the other hand, knew the words to all the hymns and all the prayers. She felt that made her a better Catholic than I was, and ensured her a seat in heaven despite anything evil she might do while on earth, or the fact that she used birth control pills. She was less interested in the commandments and treating people as she would like them to treat her. Clark admired a photo of Maria on my desk at work and made an almost indecent remark about her. I took the photo home that day, never to bring it back to my desk. Later that year, Clark invited me, and especially my girlfriend Maria, to his house for a company-wide Christmas party. Remembering the Easter egg hunt humiliation from years gone by, I didn't want to attend. But Maria insisted that she wanted to see the opulent Davidson mansion that she'd heard about from my mother. I almost never said no to Maria, so we went after I warned her that Clark was a pig who would come on to her. She claimed that she was a big girl and knew how to say no. Blinded by love, I trusted her. Looking back, it's easy to see that I was a fool. Based on my very limited experience, every man is a fool for the woman he loves, if he truly loves her with all his heart. When I tried to hug my mother, who was working at Clark's Christmas party, she shook her head no with a stern look. She didn't want me acting differently than the other guests. Maria, however, went out of her way to ignore my mother and pretended she didn't know a lowly servant. Maria took a shine to the expensive champagne my mother, in her maid's uniform, served at the party, and Maria also took a shine to the good life, while my boss took a shine to my Maria. Clark took Maria on a tour of his mansion. The two of them danced exclusively with one another, and during each dance his hands slid lower and lower from my girlfriend's back to her bum. She clearly enjoyed it. I tried to cut in, but they both refused to allow me to dance with her. At one point they both went upstairs while everyone else smirked at me, and 2 security guards barred my way. My mother watched my humiliation as she served drinks to Clark's guests. I thought of pushing past the guards, punching Clark in the mouth and breaking some teeth, but my mother grabbed and held me until I calmed down and changed my mind. She explained that I would get arrested and then probably deported, and he would just laugh at me. I would gain nothing but lose everything. Finally, she made me understand that Maria wasn't worth it. I told her how important it was to me to seek revenge on Clark. I had to get even. My mother shook her head. No, take your time. Use your brains, not your fists, and don't get even. Get ahead. Her final words to me before I left were to move with strategy, not emotion, if I wanted to succeed. My parents may lack formal education, but they are the wisest people I'd ever met. I needed to come up with a plan that would hurt him much worse than a black eye or a broken leg or two. I kissed my mother goodbye, left, and went home. I cried all the way home over my broken heart and humiliation as I plotted Clark's downfall. I know many men would drink themselves into a stupor at this time, but I was brought up to be temperate and think with a clear head. Okay, I did have one beer. I'm not perfect. In my family, we don't drown our sorrow with liquor, but with food. I drove to a delicatessen in Beverly Hills, where I drowned my sorrow in a large bowl of chicken, soup with matzo balls, and ate my way to oblivion and beyond. One of my aunts worked there for years as a waitress, and I acquired a taste for the Jewish deli food that she often brought home for us. I have another aunt, Rosario, who works on the next block at an Italian restaurant and also brought food home. With 5 aunts working as waitresses at various restaurants, I was raised on an eclectic assortment of Armenian and Japanese ethnic food as well. Once, when asked to describe our family's multinational diet, my father called it simply American. 2 days later, Maria returned, and she ignored me when I begged her to stop seeing Clark. I didn't know if it was true, but I said I could forgive her past sins, but she laughed in my face. She gave me 2 choices. Behind door number 1, I could accept that she would spend a few nights a week with my boss in return for which I would receive a 5% raise. Or if I chose door number 2, I could go to hell, lose my job, and be out on the street without Maria. Maria threatened that if I didn't go along with her plan, she would claim that I beat her and have me arrested and then deported. I hadn't been back to Mexico in 20 years, and I didn't want to return in handcuffs. Though I told her I would accept door number 1, in reality I made a third choice. I would seek revenge behind door number 3, which meant the total financial destruction of Clark Davidson. I could have left that day, but the revenge I needed against Clark meant that I had to eat his shit for another 3 months for my plan to work. I had waited since I was 7 to get even with him. Another 3 months meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. I no longer loved Maria, but I was sickened about the way she debased herself with Clark. I wouldn't take out my hatred on Maria. I understood her intense fear of poverty and her obsession for a better life. She couldn't help herself. I would double my anger on Clark for the way he treated her. I knew people who would beat him up for me, but bones quickly heal, and I wanted him to suffer where it would hurt the most for the rest of his life, his pocketbook. After Christmas break, I returned to work. Though I was choking on my hatred of my boss, I didn't let on or show it. I learned from the movie The 7 Samurai to act the fool, endure ridicule, lull my enemy into dropping his guard, and wait for the right moment to annihilate him. I acted the part of the compliant little weak to lure Clark into thinking he was safe from me, and I posed no threat. I even thanked him for my raise, though the words burnt in my mouth like acid. His fear was physical violence from me, which was never a part of my plan. My job was to open all the mail, make out checks for the bills, and hand those checks to my boss for his signature, enter the amounts in the ledger, and then mail the checks. I continued my job as usual, except that I stopped mailing the checks to the IRS, California Franchise Tax Board, property taxes, fire and car insurance, withholding taxes, and the mortgage on my boss' heavily mortgaged mansion. Those checks didn't go into the mailbox, but the shredder. I didn't steal 1 penny for myself. At worst, I was guilty of negligence, not theft. Each week I wrote a memo to my boss warning him that he wasn't paying his bills. Of course, I never gave him those memos personally. I placed them in his filing cabinet and his computer, neither of which he ever checked. Meanwhile, I had stopped paying my rent and all my other bills on the apartment. One advantage of not qualifying for a credit card because of my immigration status was that I never overspent and had no debt. I saved every dime I could and kept it in cash in an old broken opaque chandelier hanging from the ceiling in the living room. It wasn't a perfect way to fool any of my neighborhood's mini burglars, but it was good enough, since I didn't want a paper trail with banks if I had to disappear. Of course, the various creditors sent letters to Clark, but since I opened all the mail, I filed those letters where they belonged, secure in the knowledge that Clark would never open the filing cabinet and find them. If I was ever suspected of this financial espionage, those filed letters would absolve me of guilt or blame. They were my get-out-of-jail-free cards. After 3 months, Clark had over $500,000 extra in his various bank accounts and owed his various creditors that much plus interest and penalties. The total that he owed wouldn't hurt him. That's when I began phase 2, the most important part of my plan. It would be the coup de grace, the headshot. I was also the bookkeeper for one of my uncle's bars in downtown LA. He owned another 3 in Baja, Mexico. The LA bar was in a shady neighborhood with a bunch of immigrants who worked selling happy powder on street corners. They worked for a man named Enrique who drove a giant, immaculately clean, black Caddy Escalade. He came from the same Mexican village as my family. One of my cousins was married to one of his. He was the man who gave me the $100 when I won the math contest and said he would help me if I ever needed it. I now knew what Enrique did for a living, and in the past, I tried to stay clear of him. He was a semi-permanent fixture at a booth in the back of the bar. I slowly walked over to him with my hands in plain sight. He was very cautious and carried a semi-automatic Colt 1911 .45 caliber pistol with enough spare magazines to hold off a small army. I asked permission to sit down and he nodded. But first, one of his men frisked me for weapons or a recorder. I asked if he'd like $500,000. He quickly agreed after I explained the how, why, and what to him. He was impressed with the plan and once again impressed with me and said that I should work for him. I said if my plan worked out, I would be happy to work for one of the many legitimate businesses he owned. Maria hardly came back to our apartment at all. I pretended that I still wanted intimacy with her to keep up the charade. Of course, she refused, which actually suited me. Clark was a pig who probably infected her with who knows what STDs. Clark would drive her to our apartment in his Porsche 911 much too fast every Friday evening at 6 p.m. like clockwork, so she could drop off her dirty laundry and pick up her clean laundry for a weekend of clubbing which I had washed like the good little submissive they believed me to be. Clark enjoyed taunting me about this at work. It was galling, but I had to do this for my plan to work. Revenge is a dish best served cold. One Friday after work, I threw away all of Maria's clothes and possessions, handed the apartment keys to the landlord, and then I left for Mexico and never came back to work for Clark on Monday. I didn't give notice to Clark. On Monday, I started work for my uncle's 3 bars in Baja. That last Friday, Clark, as was his habit, drove his 911 at twice the speed limit towards my apartment when he rear-ended Enrique's black Escalade. He didn't realize that the car suddenly stopped because the brake lights were disconnected. Clark couldn't swerve to the left because a truck was parallel to his car blocking that maneuver and another truck blocked him on his right. Those 2 trucks were also part of the plan. The SUV had 6 passengers, each of whom required an ambulance. Clark and Maria were injured, but not fatally. Maria never wore a seatbelt no matter how much I had begged her. She went face first through the windshield, scarring her once beautiful face. Though I had not sought, planned, or even wanted revenge on Maria, karma caught up with her. I suppose I should have gloated over her misfortune, but it broke my heart when I learned what happened to her. When Clark gave the police his insurance information, he discovered that he had no insurance. The policy had been canceled for non-payment. The ticket he received for that was the least of his problems. Maria, plus the 6 occupants of the car he hit, all sued him for $500,000 each for a total of $3.5 million. Their lawyer placed a hold on Clark's bank account, so he couldn't hide his money. Then the bills from various taxing agencies and mortgages came due. Clark went from being up $500,000 to being in the hole for over $4 million. He filed for bankruptcy, lost his house and his business. Now that my mother was out of a job, she and my father moved with me to Tijuana. With all the money they had saved working for all those years, they had enough, and with U.S. Social Security to retire financially secure with a good life. Clark had been such a shit to everyone for his whole life that he had no contacts or friends who would help him now that he was poor. He dumped Maria, whose mutilated face no longer held his interest. Enrique and each of his men received over $95,000 from the bankruptcy court. They were happy. Maria also won $95,000, which paid for the plastic surgery on her face, leaving just a few of the scars still visible. Even though she broke my heart and humiliated me, I was glad that she received the money and the plastic surgery. It had never been my intent to injure her. She was just a victim of her own avarice and Clark's ill intent. In case Clark couldn't figure out what happened to him, I phoned him on his last day at work and explained to him that pushing me into the mud as a child and stealing my girlfriend had serious consequences. Thanks to me, he was broke. Do you still believe that I'm just a stupid wetback? He was speechless, and I felt relieved that 20 years of humiliation was avenged, and I no longer needed to carry that burden. I remained in Mexico for a few months to let the dust settle, and then I returned to Los Angeles. I contacted Enrique and suggested that he use the clean money he now had from the car accident to buy the Davidson's bankrupt clothing manufacturing business and hire me to run it. I explained my business plan to Enrique. Enrique had faith in me, so he did it. I changed the name of the company to Cielito Lindos Vestido. I hired a group of young Mexican women, straight out of high school, as dress designers. Some of these girls were amazingly talented. The business now focused exclusively on the Mexican teenage community and flourished. I offered girls a 75% discount on their dress if they handed out our brochures at their high schools and brought in 5 other girls who bought our dresses. I think we dressed at least half of all the Mexican-American girls in California celebrating their 15th birthday or quinceañera party, and we had about the same percentage of market share for prom dresses in the Mexican-American community. It was a market that was not only growing in size, but in affluence. Linda, or as I called her, my Cielito Lindo, who had designed Maria's dress years before, was the most talented and market-savvy designer I'd ever met. She was also smart and beautiful. I paid her tuition to attend the Fashion Institute. In return, her designs became our best sellers. She came from an old-fashioned church-going family. She invited me to Sunday dinner, which, even though we had not yet dated, meant we were almost engaged. Her father taught high school math, and we bonded over trigonometric functions and his daughter's future. Since we weren't married, she couldn't live with me, and soon I couldn't live without her, so we married. A month later, she was of course pregnant, and she designed a new line of clothing for the factory, an inspired line of maternity clothes. Sales went through the roof. With each maternity dress we sell, at Linda's insistence, we include a booklet on prenatal care for the expectant mother. At the insistence of many of our potential customers, we also sell a line of maternity prom dresses. It makes me sad that we sell so many of them. Business is very, very good because of the hard work my talented employees perform, and I share the wealth with them. At our annual Christmas party this year, as I handed out especially large Christmas bonuses, a group of my employees lifted me up on their shoulders yelling, "Viva Zapata!" as my wife, in-laws, parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins looked on with pride. Now it was my turn to cry joyous tears. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.